within your organization. And this deck, the bibliography, the links that we have for a lot of this content will be made available on our website as well. So we'll be sending follow-ups and emails. If you do have questions, for those of you that are on Zoom, please type those in the chat function in the Q&A, and we'll try to address those as we go through this morning. So quick nod to my colleagues, both Lisa Barone, Sharon Lawless, and I keep forgetting to put Katie Source on here, all really help to contribute to a lot of the content that is not only in our annual sort of 2021 trends report, but also the presentation that you're about to see today. So I want to thank them for their work and their perspective on a lot of these topics and issues. I'm happy to be kind of carrying the water for them, I guess. So telemedicine, what are we talking about? It's taking up a lot of new monikers lately: desktop manner, website manner, phone side manner. But I'm stepping outside the technology, and this will not be a technical presentation. We're not going to be talking about telemedicine platforms and some of the integrations from an IT perspective, but really looking at how it can help build your organization's brand and how it can embrace what patients need and want. And in particular, I think, not only making sure the promise is accurate, living up to the promise and delivering on the promise all contributes to what now is becoming the digital equivalent of bedside manner. And so whether you call it desktop manner, website manner, phone side manner, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And it can be a real game changer. I know many of us work in environments where, there are a lot of opinions that, the statistics that a particular surgeon or physician may have, the degrees that are hanging on his or her wall should be the driver and the gravity that brings patients, flocking to your doors. But even those best patients or physicians can lose a patient when they're not making those deep connections. Increasingly, the emphasis in healthcare is on value and engaging them, building a stronger sort of website manner really is a key driver for that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's certainly something that consumers, patients, expect every other place in their lives. We're a drive-through society. We are one-click Amazon purchasing. In fact, this is going to be the cardboard Christmas for most of us. So there's a instant sense of gratification of customer service. If you've ever bought anything from Wayfair, their return policies, started by LL Bean. I mean, all of this is what shapes consumers' points of view, and how they're treated elsewhere, in the world is carried with them into obviously the healthcare setting. So let's talk about telemedicine trending. This is certainly not anything that's new, and frankly, we could have had this presentation in some equivalent 10 years ago. But what's really interesting, I think, is how it's been trending and the impact of COVID on it. Let me show you what I mean here. First, pre-COVID, and I think this is pretty much true for most of our organizations, most of the people that I know are in the audience today. Prior to COVID in the United States, more than 80% of the hospitals and health systems nationwide offered telemedicine. But as many of us know, it just wasn't embraced by consumers. The consumer demand for it was lagging. We just haven't had anything to reorient our compass, to really reset our behaviors and patterns. And so that consumer demand just hadn't caught up to the technology yet, and we hadn't really fully embraced it, nor did our patients or we as healthcare institutions see the benefits of that for our organization. So pretty obvious question, was the COVID pandemic the boon for telemedicine? So let's look at this through Google Trends. And if you haven't played with this tool yet, it's really fabulous. And for my friends out there that are data geeks, you'll go down this rabbit hole and probably never emerge for the rest of the day. Assuming there's a number of search rankings, and so, depending on what the term is, Google will index those terms and start to plot those over time. And so the two things that we'll look at are telemedicine and coronavirus in a moment. But depending on the size of the market that you're in, your institution, you can start to look at different keywords and phrases, different brands, your names, competitors' names, just to get a sense of what's happening within Google's world, which really is a good indicator of sort of the broader societal context for sure. So let's take a look first at the term telemedicine. And this is a 5-year plot going back to 2015. And what we start to see here is things just percolating along. Telemedicine is not new. It is not anything that we haven't all been working with for probably the better part of a decade or more. But what's not surprising is the immense amount of spike that was happening here. And so then the question is, and it's probably pretty obvious, the correlation. So once I start to overlay telemedicine in blue with coronavirus terms in red, what I found most surprising, though, when I looked at this was that both of these terms peaked the week of March 15th through the 21st and then started to lag a little bit. But very interesting and perhaps not surprising, but this really was the tipping point for telemedicine. All of that, very clearly driven by the coronavirus pandemic, and in particular in the United States, as that looked to spike in mid-March. So this, going back a slide, looking at just telemedicine by itself, was really humming along. We were trying to do our best to promote it, trying to embrace it, get consumers on board. But it really took the pandemic to just take that and really push that into what we're talking and doing. Now, just because this is trailing doesn't necessarily mean that we've stopped talking about it. The numbers and stats that are here are incredibly, significant compared to what they were previously. We started talking about it. We looked at how we needed to pivot and shift and deliver on a lot of healthcare models. And now that's just following us through. One quick note, these charts are not to scale. If it were, and when I tried to plot that, you couldn't even see the term telemedicine because it was eclipsed, just immensely by the coronavirus term. So yes, this has become the tipping point for that. And what's the outlook? What is happening? There was a McKinsey report. Again, we have a lot of these in our bibliography. How has this pandemic changed the outlook for telehealth? And to my previous slide, 11% of consumers were using some sort of telehealth, telemedicine in 2019. Now more than 76% of the people surveyed, and this is statistically projectable, are interested in using it going forward. So we've hit that tipping point. The technology is here to stay. Consumers are eager to embrace it. And we are, most of us, the vast majority of us are already in position to start delivering on it. So how do we then merge those two concepts as marketers? How do we take what consumers need and want and look at our technologies, not only to build our brand, but to build stronger bonds and brand loyalty with our patients? And we'll talk about as we kind of move forward here. So why does it matter? In another report, and again in our bibliography, the top 4 reasons cited for consumers wanting to embrace telemedicine, and in particular how you deliver telemedicine, that website manner. The 4 reasons that they gave in rank order were convenience, and certainly telemedicine saves a tremendous amount of time to commute back and forth. Taking multiple buses, subways, driving longer distances for rural, skipping waiting rooms, wait times, check-ins, and those kind of things. Speaking of, waiting rooms, safety became part of the second largest reason why they want to embrace telemedicine. It's just keeping me out of waiting rooms that I frankly don't want to be in. Speed, most consumers perceive or actually know that they can get appointments faster via telemedicine than they can in person. And then the quality is something we'll talk about here. So the patient experience is really what's driving quality. They believe that they can get an equal or better quality experience in some cases through telemedicine than they can in person for some cases or some instances, and it depends obviously on the circumstance. But patient experience, their overall experience with any organization, any brand, any institution, is what drives the quality. We've talked about this before, that holistic experience from ease of parking, cleanliness of your hallways, right through to the clinical outcomes are all part of the equation. And then sometimes it just doesn't fairly match up with what we know we're delivering as healthcare providers. Very often we are solely focused on great, clinical outcomes and unfairly dinged proportionately by our patients when all they remember from the experience was the food was cold, the hallway was messy, the bathroom in my recovery room was a mess. So we'll talk about that and how that really relates a little bit to website manner. And because of that, because of the consumer's perspective, that sense of empathy, and we've talked about this before on previous webinars, the empathy that's exhibited through an entire journey, again, from a welcoming face, helping to get them checked in, to the physician who, and we hear this a lot, really spends time to get to know me. I don't feel like I'm rushed, all those things that we hear in our surveys and studies. That sense of patient empathy is really what increases the value, which increases the patient's experience, which is a perception and driver of quality. That ultimately goes into not only word of mouth referrals, but even now online reviews and rankings. And again, we'll talk about this as we go through the next several slides here in a moment. So what is the opportunity? We know that it's here to stay. Hybrid care, will be the future for these organizations. And as I mentioned before, patients don't want to sit in a waiting room if they can avoid it, frankly. Convenience is also pretty significant. In one of the studies in our bibliography, it was noted that 20% of all emergency room visits could be avoided via urgent care offerings, and now through perhaps, depending on the circumstance, pushing those urgent care procedures into something more like telemedicine. So again, we're not talking about acute trauma, but for things like strep throat or similar issues. And again, this is a positive impact that not only is convenient for patients, but will help them embrace their care, perhaps even take a step sooner or faster than they might if they had to be inconvenienced by some of the travel issues that they would be dealing with. So let's talk about not only the creative strategies that go into communicating and marketing and talking about telemedicine, because I think it's important we start there. Not only our patients and our public know what telemedicine is, they have a sense of what it is, and perhaps they're familiar with the technology, but they're very influenced by our marketing, by our public relations, our social media. And so we did a very ad hoc look around the country, and some of you may be represented here completely by accident, but we've put some of your ads into several different categories. And I think it's important to understand how we start to communicate about telemedicine and set up that promise for what's to come. So the first category from a creative strategy standpoint is the expectation, well, what is it? And here are some examples of institutions that are putting ads out that basically explain what is telemedicine. Let me help define it, because I believe in these instances that my community isn't necessarily familiar with it. And so you'll see these types of either messages or pages on websites, and that's the start of the conversation, helping to define what is telehealth, what is telemedicine. The other type, and what this brings us to then, is, well, we've got it. The other category of creative messages that we're seeing are the we have it, we've got telehealth or telemedicine. So the headlines that you're seeing here, we're now offering it, we have it, it's available here, at the headline level, again, is a second creative strategy that we're seeing people use in their promotion of it. And the third is how it works. Not only pages on websites, but also ads that start to describe, well, how does telemedicine work? So there is, what we're trying to build here is this continuum of what is it, how does it work? And then lastly, is it right for me? There's a certain set of creative strategies here. And in this one particular, this is a paid sort of healthcare model app that speaks to that sense of trust and preference. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, because there's no right or wrong strategy depending on your organization, what you see happening in your community. Your public better than I would, but I think it's important to see that different continuum. So as we move into tips and takeaways for marketers, First and broadest, we think it's important to take a multi-channel approach to promoting and marketing your telemedicine. It should be something that is part of, all the tools in your toolbox. And we'll talk about this on the next couple slides in terms of how it fits into your overall institutional goals, your marketing plan, and which creative strategy might be right for each sort of phase of that funnel or tactic in particular. But keeping in mind that this is something that is very appropriate for websites and emails and your patient portals and public relations, advertising, social media. We should be talking about these in all places for the same reasons we promote service lines and our brand in all these places. So looking at this specifically, I think it's important to define and align your marketing goals with these different tactics that we've described previously. Some of the leading indicators that you may have are the awareness that you can create through some of the promotion media. So email and advertising and social media are going to drive awareness. And you'll know some of your web stats, your clicks, your projections on reach that you've got and frequency, which then pushes into some of the marketing conversions, which are going to help drive telehealth, telemedicine volume, which typically it's a website or perhaps even pushing farther into a patient portal where they can start to engage in that technology. So I think it's very important to keep in mind not only the different media, where the different media types would live in that continuum, but building out messages so that it aligns with your marketing goals and putting the right messages in the right places. So with that in mind, what are the right creative strategies for each tactic? As we've kind of broken it down, looking at that continuum from, from an advertising standpoint, the messaging strategies that we showed a moment ago, we've got it, or perhaps even messages of differentiation that ours is better, are best suited, we believe, for advertising and perhaps even social media, some of those external promotions where you've got short attention spans, and just raising awareness that you have it and what it is and how that works. Second category, I think, is earned media. And public relations is a great place to tell a deeper story to a public that's interested in hearing it. So having a sense of, what a fabulous time for housekeeping to start working on that, but I think they'll be done in a moment here. This is it wouldn't be a pandemic if it wasn't, if I hadn't muted myself and kept talking or had a dog barking in the background. So anyway, that second category in public relations, is a great place for demonstrations or to tell a deeper story about what is this or how does it work. And that's where you might have a more captive audience that either wants to be educated or could benefit from the, sort of impartial point of view that news media can carry. Email, social media, texting, any online listings are great places for those we've got it messages, or even now how to get started messages. And then I think lastly, as you bring them through that funnel, that sense of how does this work, and how do you get started, are perfect messaging strategies for websites and in particular those patient portals. So as we looked at those examples before, looking at the 4 different types of creative strategies, in our opinion, and as we think about that funnel and bringing people through a continuum, raising awareness, how does it work? What is it? Yes, we have it. How do you get started? Is a good continuum, and perhaps this is a good guide for which are the right messages for the right media types to reach people, in their space or for their attention span. So moving on to other tips and takeaways for marketers. And we'll talk about tips and takeaways for providers. I think most of us that are tuning in are operations, marketing, public relations folks, but I did want to share some things in a moment that you can bring back to your internal, teams, to, trainings and workshops, tips for any folks that are going to be, having FaceTime on telemedicine. So we'll talk about those in a second, but first, if you haven't already, I think it's really essential updating your search terms, your Google ads with virtual keywords. Many of us are kind of in a set it and forget it mode when it comes to our search advertising, and whether we're doing this in-house or doing it with an external marketing partner. we know the institution's brand, we know the key messages, we know the service lines that we want to promote, we have a sense of what those keywords are that'll bring people to all of those different things. But updating all of that with virtual terms, telehealth, telemedicine, virtual, no in person, et cetera, I think is really critical. And this also extends true to recruitment and HR promotions as well, that there may be some hesitation, especially bringing people in from outside of healthcare that want to know that you're being safe right from the beginning. So we think that that's equally important. Also adjusting your messaging as you're going based on reviews and feedback. And again, if you're not looking at your institution and how you're ranking on Google reviews and Yelp and Facebook and health grades, I think that that's essential. They're not always top drivers for every service line, but holistically, I think consumers are just looking at every other experience, whether it's vacation or restaurants, any type of service industry is getting some sort of review. They're heating and air conditioning, plumbing, all of those other things. And I don't mean to equate all of those industries into the same sort of category, but that sense that we should be looking at our reviews, but also updating those, learning and hearing the feedback that's happening. If there are some hesitations, if there are some experiences that aren't particularly robust, how do we adjust our messaging based on, what's happening and literally the feedback we're getting, not only on these visible platforms, but also the surveys that we're sending out to many of our patients. Educational content, we saw this was something that many organizations try to do from an advertising standpoint, but as you're pushing people deeper within your marketing funnel, bringing them to either pages or flyers where they can, really embrace folks that may have the technologies but don't necessarily know how to use it. Keeping in mind that, as we go farther and farther along here in life, older audiences grew up on computers, and that wasn't necessarily the case 20, 30 years ago, at least when I started my career. So they're becoming a little bit more technologically savvy. We're seeing seniors being one of the fastest growing segments on social media to keep in touch with their families and see what the grandkids are doing. So they're ready to embrace technology, but it's very new. And in particular, it's healthcare technology. So having a sense of, that how it works, content, I think is critical, especially for first-time users. And there's an example here that I had found on the web about that, which I think really does really well. Is this your first experience? Do you know what to expect? Here are a set of expectations, and here are the steps to get started. Perhaps even building that out with positive reviews and even video testimonials from real people. I'm a big fan of, if the public will spend time with you to record a quick comment, even something like this in a Zoom platform, getting that content out there to say, gosh, I'm Sue from this particular, hometown in my service area. And it was my first experience with this, and here's how it went, and this is what I learned from it and why I like it. Again, this healthcare in particular is a very testimonial driven industry from a marketing communication standpoint. So if you can start to get people in your community and in your public to then, balance out the don't take my word for it, but, listen to what your neighbors have to say, I think that'll help you minimize any of the resistance and sort of overcome those obstacles. So the next section, tips and takeaways for providers. And I'll go through this kind of quickly because I know we're a little short on time. I promised to get everybody out. We're trying to wrap up all of our meetings and webinars with at least a 10 to 15 minute window. One of the things we've been hearing and noticing even ourselves is everybody just seems to be booked, right up to the minute, from meeting to meeting to meeting. So starting meetings at 5 after, ending them at 10, 15 minutes of is the gift of free time. And if you're not already doing it within your organization, you'll make a lot of friends if you start that way. So going back to website manner, these are some of the tips and takeaways that we wanted to share with you that you can share with your providers. And again, all of this is, one thing I didn't include is making all of these patient experiences HIPAA-rific. So we'll try to talk about that a little bit as we go through here. But But first, and to my point a moment ago, because we're so stacked up with a lot of digital appointments, and in our cases, meetings, and thank you for tuning in. Many of you are probably, at least on the East Coast, eating lunch right now as you're watching this. Don't forget to spend time, that same kind of thing as you walked into the exam room, just telling the patient not only a little bit about yourself, but also what to expect during this appointment. I think, it's important that we just remember to spend a couple minutes, just kind of getting to know them, even looking around and commenting about them, and especially if they're a repeat patient, what we did know about them, and also leaving time at the end for, any questions that they might have, any dialogue. As we've seen, as many of you have seen in your patient surveys, that piece in particular, the doctor spent a lot of time with me, or the doctor spent as much time with me as the nurses, can be really, really essential to building those bonds and those relationships. And with that in mind, don't quickly and abruptly end just flip the switch off. Some of these things might be pretty obvious, but as we go through very busy days, keeping this in mind, I think, is essential. Certainly displaying empathy is important, and especially as we're talking about things through telemedicine, that might be better to move to an in-person conversation, for more serious medical conditions. I think it's, very essential. Sort of one of the basics for bedside manner that should translate well into this. The other is maintaining eye contact. And I think, and I'm trying to do this throughout this presentation, it's different with technology than it is in person. You don't have a face to be looking at it. In my case, I'm trying to also read slides at the same time. I'm trying to at least face the camera. But very often, I think many of us have seen, even our own team members, we've got multiple screens set up on our desks, and it's pretty easy to be, typing some notes into the, monitor over here, but I'm at 3/4 view, and I just feel like I'm missing a connection because I'm not looking right at you and at least trying to engage you in the face that's coming back at me on screen. Now, with that in mind, I think explaining to the patient what you're doing, before you do it, and sort of narrating with them, about the experience. So if you are going to be using other screens, and if you do want to type notes into the patient's records chart, and it's over here, explaining that at the beginning of the session, I think, is particularly important, just so that they know you're not over here trying to, satisfy a margin call from your broker, or just checking your email or seeing what's happening on Facebook. So it's that sense of dedication, and the time you're going to spend. It's something that I think we have to do in telemedicine that we didn't in person. In person, we might have a chart, and it's pretty obvious that we're talking, and now I'm writing something down. But we're not really sure what's happening over here and what's happening off center. So that in particular becomes important. Be aware of your surroundings. In my case, I'm in a pretty well decorated office, but I did want a more professional environment. So I've got my studio lights, I've got my green screen, and trying to connect as professionally as possible. For those of you that are on meetings with me, this is where the frog is. So I have a giant frog painting with these really funky glasses, but not exactly appropriate to bring, from a credibility standpoint. So, a cluttered, messy room is not necessarily something that people want to see, and the lighting even makes a big difference as well. So, communicating clearly, and I talked about this a moment ago, if you're going to look away to a chart, let people know what you're doing, sort of narrate with them and take them through the process. And so thank you very much, Paul, for telling me this. Just give me 1 second. I want to update your chart over here. That whole process, I think, is good, so that they interpret that you're actually paying attention, and what you're doing is truly focused on them, even if you're not making direct eye contact. Certainly being comfortable with the technology, speaks to a little bit of proficiency, since many of us are very comfortable with, Apple's FaceTime or Zoom or other technologies. It's something, especially now 10 months in, 11 months into the pandemic, that we should be comfortable with at this point. And so I think about this very often, that I do, we call it the airline tray table analogy. So, and many of you have heard me describe this before. If the airline can't keep the tray table clean, that I'll flip this thing down and have a snack mid-flight. If that's not clean, it's probably one of the easiest things to maintain in the plane. And if you can't handle something as simple as that, well, how are you doing on the more complicated things like the engines? And this is not something I want to think about when I'm at 30,000 feet. Training the technology, getting comfortable with the technology, even having a colleague with you for the first few until you get more comfortable with it, I think helps to alleviate any of those sort of implied concerns that consumers might have. And paying attention to body language. I think, posture matters. Paying attention not only to your own body language, but to those of your patient, those nonverbal, facial expressions and things like that. But in particular, your own body language. Do you want to be seated way back here like this, as if what the patient has to say is the most important thing, even at the end of a long, busy day? But posture matters. I think it's important to sort of have an action pose, be sort of leaning in as you're going through the conversation. Certainly avoiding conversations or phone calls, even the margin call that I mentioned earlier is important, but save that for time in between your patient, meetings. And in particular, video doesn't allow much for, or actually creates opportunities for interruption. So be careful. There's a lot of technology delays, even though your message might be out on a broadband, especially in rural areas. They may not have the fastest connections. So that creates a little bit of a lag time. And I think, just pausing for a second to allow people to comment, I think is important, as you're kind of going through, and avoid sort of unintentionally talking over each other. And I think the other thing is active listening. Repeating back what your patient said so that they feel understood, so that they feel validated, and they know that you heard exactly what they said. For those of you that know me, I'm a recreational pilot, and it's extremely important. In fact, I have to repeat back commands that I'm given by air traffic control, or if I'm taxiing on a particular runway. Air traffic control will tell me to go from A to B to C, and I have to say, okay, I am going from A to B to C, and they will say, readback is correct. So they know that I heard, and I validated that I heard by playing back exactly what was said. And so there are times like that where it's extremely important. And in this case, I think it contributes not only to the accuracy of the message, but also the, validating the patient that you're truly listening. So, patient, what I think I'm hearing you say is, these are the symptoms and these are the issues, et cetera. Do I have that correct? Okay, great. Now let's talk about the next part of our conversation. So that's basically the essence of our presentation so far. We really wanted to share not only the trends that were happening in telemedicine, just to get us all on the same page. We did want to talk about the implications for marketers and how this could fit into not only your marketing plan, recognizing the different types of the creative strategies, how those different creative strategies can be used, and what's most appropriate for the different types of media that you're going to be using to communicate with patients as you go from sort of advertising to conversion to appointments. And even some provider tips. And for those of you that were scrambling to take notes, please know that we'll reach out to you with a link to our presentation deck as well. So thank you for joining us. There's a couple other panel discussions actually that are coming up in the next several weeks that I wanted to share with you. So if you have additional questions and conversations, we have not only our full trends report online, and we'll make those links available. Two other events coming up, December 17th at noon Eastern time. We have a panel discussion with really three very interesting perspectives, and we're talking about regaining revenue and stabilizing organizational finances, at least from an external point of view. And by that I mean we have myself representing marketing and public relations, which would raise awareness among patients and drive volume and revenue. Joining me will be Tracy Brooks from Schenker Russo and Clark, who is a healthcare lobbyist and advocate, former executive director for a number of healthcare organizations, and she'll be looking at it from that funding perspective. And Maureen Yee, who is a former development officer for a number of hospitals and health systems, now independent consultant. So she'll be looking at that from a philanthropic point of view. So I think this will be a really interesting perspective, one that'll probably probably take a solid hour. We may even run a couple minutes on that as we're going through. So please join us for that on December 17th. And on June 21st, we have a upcoming also panel discussion on recruitment and retention. This has been something a lot of you have been asking about. We've built a panel discussion of not only formal recruiters, but also recruiters for not only permanent placement, but also temporary placement. So what the importance is of an employer brand, how to build up that employment pipeline, whether it's temporary or permanent, and that'll be in January. For those of you that are on our lists and tuning in on social media, keep an eye out for all of those as we start to promote those in the coming days and weeks. So on behalf of my colleagues, Katie, Lisa, Sharon, myself, I want to thank everybody for joining us today that's here live on Zoom. For those of you that are tuning in live stream on social media, on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, any of your questions and comments that you put in the chat, we'll be answering offline on those. And again, we have a bibliography which I'll share as part of our follow-up on that. So thank you. Hope this was helpful for everybody, and we look forward to connecting again in the future. Thanks.